Hello and welcome to IAMC Radio and Podcast. Today on Understanding Our History, we're exploring Dele Farotimi's critique of the Nigerian political landscape, as presented in his book, Do Not Die in Their War. Right off the bat, I was struck by how bluntly he challenges some of the core narratives about Nigeria.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches, does he? It's refreshing, actually. One of the first things that caught my eye was his analogy of a knock-kneed person trying to carry a load. It's such a vivid image, and it really gets to the heart of his argument that Nigeria's problems are rooted in a fundamentally flawed system.
It's like he's saying you can't just keep slapping on bandages and expecting a full recovery. You have to address the underlying structural issues. And he doesn't just throw out the analogy and move on. He gives concrete historical examples like the creation of River State back in 1967.
Right. He argues that it wasn't really about serving the needs of the people, but more about political maneuvering, specifically weakening the Igbo population. And this, he says, is a pattern that repeats itself throughout Nigeria's history. These attempts to restructure often miss the mark because they fail to address the core imbalance of power.
So for those of us who aren't as familiar with Nigerian history, what does that mean in practice? What does this power imbalance actually look like?
We'll take the way Nigeria operates. It's called a federation. But Farotimi argues it functions more like a centralized state. All the key decisions are made at the federal level, which stifles true democracy and local governance.
He uses this really powerful phrase, living a lie, to describe this situation. It's like there's this huge gap between the ideals Nigeria claims to uphold and the reality people experience every day. What do you think is the biggest lie being perpetuated?
That's a great question. I think Farotimi would say it's the idea that hard work and meritocracy will get you ahead. He argues that the system is actually rigged in favor of those with connections and those willing to cut corners.
He has that example of people bypassing the mandatory National Youth Service Corps requirement through bribes and connections. It's like a shortcut culture has permeated every level of society.
Exactly. And that erosion of fairness and equal opportunity is a symptom of a much deeper problem. It's like he says with that other analogy, planting okra and expecting to harvest cocoa. You can't just wish for different outcomes without changing the underlying system that produces them.
And this living a lie extends to the political sphere as well, right?
Yeah.
Farotimi is incredibly critical of how elections are conducted in Nigeria. It's almost like he's saying the system is designed to keep the same people in power regardless of what the people actually want.
He certainly seems to think so. He points to the 2019 elections, particularly the events in Ekiti and Osun states, as prime examples of vote buying, manipulation, and the suppression of genuine democratic processes.
So if the system is rigged and elections are compromised, where does that leave the average Nigerian? Does Farotimi offer any solutions, or is it all just doom and gloom?
He's definitely not one to sugarcoat things, but he does offer a way forward. But before we get into that, I think it's important to understand his analysis of some of the key players in Nigerian politics. Figures like Buhari, Obasanjo, and Tinubu. He really digs into their actions and how they've shaped the country's trajectory, for better or for worse.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Let's start with Buhari. He came into office promising change, a crackdown on corruption. Does Farotimi buy it?
Not really. He argues that despite the rhetoric, Buhari's administration has actually exhibited a lot of the same problems that have plagued previous governments. He cites instances of ethnic favoritism and a disregard for the rule of law, which directly contradicts the principles Buhari campaigned on.
Now, what about Obasanjo and Tinubu? They've both been incredibly influential figures in Nigerian politics. What's Farotimi's take on their relationship and their impact on the country?
He dives into their shared history, their ambition, and how their actions have intertwined to shape the political landscape. It's a complicated dynamic with periods of cooperation and periods of tension and power struggles. He seems to suggest that their personal ambitions often took precedence over the needs of the people.
One figure who seems to draw Farotimi's particular ire is Bola Tinubu. He goes so far as to call Tinubu Akintola reborn, drawing a sharp contrast with the revered Yoruba leader Obafemi Awolowo. That's a pretty loaded comparison, and probably one that needs some context for those who might not be familiar with these figures.
You're absolutely right. To understand this comparison, we need to step back a bit. Samuel Ladoke Akintola was a controversial figure from Nigeria's First Republic. He was a Yoruba leader, but one who many felt prioritized personal power over the welfare of the people. Farotimi sees a similar pattern in Tinubu's actions.
So he's essentially saying that Tinubu is more interested in consolidating power than in serving the interests of the Yoruba people.
That's the crux of his argument. He contrasts this with Awolowo, who he portrays as a visionary leader dedicated to the betterment of the Yoruba people. Awolowo focused on education, social development, ethical leadership, qualities that Farotimi believes are sorely lacking in Tinubu's approach.
Speaking of education, Farotimi seems particularly concerned about the state of education and knowledge in Nigeria. He even suggests that the decline in educational standards has made the population more vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation.
That's right. He argues that a well-informed and educated populace is crucial for a functioning democracy. People need to be equipped to critically evaluate information, hold their leaders accountable, and make informed choices. When education suffers, it creates a vacuum that can be easily filled by those who seek to exploit the situation for their own gain.
So where do we go from here? If the system is flawed, if leaders are more interested in self-preservation than progress, what hope is there for Nigeria?
Well, that's where Farotimi's call to action comes in. He ends his book with this powerful phrase, "Do not die in their war." It's a call for Nigerians to wake up to recognize their own power and to refuse to be pawns in the political games of the elite.
He's essentially saying, don't let them use you. Don't be complicit in a system that's designed to keep you down. It's a pretty powerful message.
Absolutely. And it's not just about recognizing the problem. He's calling for a fundamental shift in mindset, a move away from apathy and towards active engagement in shaping the future of Nigeria. It's not just about individual leaders, though. Farotimi argues that this culture of exploitation and manipulation is deeply ingrained in the very fabric of Nigerian society. He even draws a parallel between the political climate in Yorubaland today and the events that led up to the Nigerian Civil War.
Wait, really? That seems like a pretty serious comparison. What's the connection there?
He's highlighting the dangers of political maneuvering that prioritizes personal gain over the welfare of the people. He sees echoes of the same divisive tactics, the same willingness to exploit ethnic and religious differences for political advantage. And, he's not just pointing fingers, he's also critical of the Yoruba people themselves.
Oh, how so? I thought he was a big admirer of Awolowo and what he stood for.
He is. But he's also concerned about how the Yoruba people have strayed from the path Awolowo laid out. He argues that the decline in educational standards has made them more susceptible to the allure of quick fixes and empty promises. They've become, in his words, disoriented, losing sight of their history and their potential.
So instead of demanding real solutions, they're falling for the same old tricks.
That's his point. And he sees this as a deliberate strategy employed by those in power. It's easier to control a population that's poorly educated, that's struggling to make ends meet, that's constantly looking for a savior.
It's interesting how he connects this back to the idea of a monolithic North that we touched on earlier. He seems to think that this concept has been used to maintain a certain power structure to keep the South, and particularly the Yoruba people, at a disadvantage.
Yes, he argues that this notion of a unified North is a myth, a fabrication that's been used to justify a system that benefits a select few, at the expense of the many. And he traces this back to colonial times, to the way the British structured the country, giving disproportionate power to the North.
So this power imbalance was baked into the system from the start.
Exactly. And it's continued to play out after independence, impacting everything from resource allocation to political representation. It's like a rigged game where the rules are always tilted in favor of one side.
And he sees Buhari as a continuation of this legacy.
Yes. He argues that Buhari's actions often reflect this same pattern of ethnic favoritism, of prioritizing the interests of a particular group over the needs of the nation as a whole. He's quite critical of Buhari's governance, arguing that it's been marked by a disregard for the rule of law and a tendency to consolidate power rather than address the root causes of Nigeria's problems.
He's not holding back, is he? It's pretty bold to call out a sitting president like that.
He's not afraid to speak truth to power, that's for sure. And it's not just Buhari. He also has some harsh words for the Nigerian media.
Speaking of manipulation, that's a good segue. I know Farotimi is pretty scathing in his assessment of the Nigerian press. What's his beef with them?
He argues that instead of holding those in power accountable, the media has often become complicit in spreading misinformation and propaganda. It's like they've become part of the machine, more interested in serving particular interests than in reporting the truth.
He talks about how truth has become subjective in Nigeria, right? Like there are competing narratives being pushed depending on who you listen to.
Exactly. And he sees this as a dangerous trend. It erodes trust in institutions, undermines the foundations of a healthy democracy, and makes it even harder for people to distinguish fact from fiction.
So it's like everyone's fighting their own little war, pushing their own agenda, and the truth gets lost in the crossfire.
That's a great way to put it. And it creates this atmosphere of confusion and distrust where it's easy for those in power to manipulate the narrative and maintain their grip on control.
So if the system is rigged, if leaders are exploiting the situation and the media is complicit, what's the average Nigerian supposed to do? Is Farotimi just leaving us with a sense of hopelessness?
No, not at all. Remember his call to action. Do not die in their war. It's a call to recognize the problem, yes, but it's also a call to reclaim your agency, to refuse to be a victim. He's saying don't let them define your reality, don't let them dictate your future.
So it's about recognizing the patterns, the manipulations, and then choosing a different path.
Exactly. It's about becoming more informed, more engaged, and more willing to challenge the status quo. It's about demanding better from your leaders, holding them accountable for their actions, and working together to create a more just and equitable society.
It's not about overthrowing the system then, but about changing it from within.
That's a good way to put it. It's about recognizing your own power as a citizen and using it to demand change, to push for reform, and to create a system that truly serves the needs of the people.
But that sounds like a long and difficult process. Where do you even start?
Well, that's where Farotimi's vision for a new Nigeria comes in. He doesn't just offer a critique, he actually lays out some concrete ideas for how things could be different.
Okay, so let's talk about solutions. What does Farotimi propose? Does he have a roadmap for getting Nigeria out of this mess?
He does, actually. He lays out some pretty specific proposals for addressing the systemic issues we've been discussing. He focuses particularly on education, economic empowerment, and political reform.
You mentioned earlier that he sees education as crucial for empowering people. What exactly does he propose in terms of educational reform?
He advocates for a complete overhaul of the education system, one that emphasizes critical thinking, problem solving, and civic engagement. He wants to move away from rote memorization and towards a curriculum that equips students with the skills they need to be active and informed citizens.
So it's not just about increasing access to education, it's about changing the very nature of what's being taught.
Right. It's about moving away from a system that produces passive followers and towards one that cultivates critical thinkers, who are capable of challenging the status quo and demanding better from their leaders.
And what about economic empowerment? How does Farotimi see that fitting into his vision for a new Nigeria?
He argues that true economic empowerment can only come from addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality. He advocates for policies that promote sustainable development, create opportunities for small businesses, and ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared more equitably.
So it's about moving away from a system that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few, and towards one that creates opportunities for everyone to thrive.
Exactly. He believes that a more inclusive and equitable economy is essential for building a stable and prosperous society.
And lastly, political reform. I know Farotimi is pretty critical of the current political system. What kind of changes does he propose?
He advocates for a move away from the centralized power structure that we talked about earlier. He wants to see more power devolve to the local level, giving communities more control over their own affairs.
So less power concentrated at the federal level and more autonomy for local governments.
Right. He believes that this would make the system more responsive to the needs of the people and would help to reduce corruption and abuse of power. He also calls for electoral reforms that would make elections more free and fair, ensuring that the will of the people is actually reflected in the outcome.
It sounds like he's calling for a pretty radical transformation of the entire system. Do you think it's realistic? Is there any appetite for this kind of change in Nigeria?
That's the big question, isn't it? Change is never easy, especially when it challenges the interests of those in power. But I think what Farotimi is trying to do is to spark a conversation, to plant a seed in the minds of the Nigerian people.
He's trying to get people to see that a different future is possible, that things don't have to be the way they've always been.
Exactly. He's saying, look, I know things are tough. I know the system is rigged against you, but don't give up hope. Don't let them win. Remember, do not die in their war.
It's a powerful message, one that I think resonates deeply with a lot of Nigerians who are tired of the status quo, who are hungry for change.
It's a reminder that change starts with each of us. It starts with recognizing our own power, with refusing to be complicit in a system that perpetuates injustice, and with demanding better from those who claim to represent us.
It's about taking ownership of our future and working together to create the Nigeria we want to see.
Yes, and that's perhaps the most hopeful message to take away from Do Not Die in Their War. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, the power to create change ultimately resides with the people.
It's a call to action, a challenge to rise above the divisions of the past and to embrace a shared vision for the future.
It's a book that will provoke debate, spark discussion, and hopefully inspire action.
Until next time, thank you for listening to Understanding Our History.